The world is changing at breathtaking speeds, with trends and fads popping up and passing away at breakneck pace. Against that backdrop of nearly constant upheaval, we welcome you to the Sunday Scotch Society. Over delectable, sumptuous scotches and with the occasional good cigar in hand, we have open, honest, and uninhibited conversation about whatever strikes our fancy. Whether it's the critical issue of the day or a deep dive down the rabbit hole, we take it all seriously while having a good time. Join us for a stiff drink and a great conversation. Good afternoon and welcome to this week's episode of the Sunday Scotch Society. My name is Quincy Parker, and today it's just me. Matthew and I will be back together for our next episode. But today, I just wanted to take, a few minutes and chat with you about single malt Scotch and blended Scotch and what Scotch is. And, it's because so many people who listen to the show and for which I'm incredibly grateful, and to all of those of you who are listening, thank you. But I get a lot of questions about what Scotch is and how to enjoy it and why I like it so much. So I thought that today I would take the opportunity to spend a little time talking about Scotch, what it is, what it isn't, and how I enjoy it, and how I think you might enjoy it too, if it's a thing that you have the opportunity to enjoy. And joining me for this journey is the Macallan 12-year-old double cask. It is one of my sort of favorite bottles of Scotch. It's a single malt from one of the most amazing distilleries in the world, the Macallan. And the 12-year-old double cask is kind of their sort of entry-level Scotch. It is full of, typical Macallan flavors. There's vanilla, there's a little cinnamon, there's some butter, there's a little spice, there's some smoke, and there's but the overall taste is, for me, a really brilliant balance between slightly sweet with just a hint of fruit and a bit of smoke. And I really think that as a journey into the world of Scotch, the Macallan 12-year-old double cask is a great place to start. And of course, as we continue this journey, over the however many episodes we do of the Sunday Scotch Society, you by the end of it, hopefully you'll understand everything from the age statement to things like what double cask means and those sorts of things. But here we go with the thing that we like to do. So there it is. I have poured the dram, and now it's time for me to talk about the nose. So a little sniff just to get my nose all set up so that I can actually smell it without being overwhelmed by the alcohol in the dram. So when you're nosing Scotch, you generally what you want to do is open your mouth just a little bit, and then get your nose right up in there, and then gently inhale through your nose to feel and smell what the aromas in the Scotch are doing. And right away I smell cinnamon, I smell vanilla, there's a baked fruit undertone, I smell a little bit of the sweetness from one of the casks. Is a sherry cask, and you get a little sweetness off of that. And there's a little spice, as I say, maybe some white pepper. Yeah, so that's the nose, and I'll take my first sip in a second here. It's had some time to breathe in the glass just a bit. Oh man, it's so good. It coats your tongue with the oils from the barrel, and without being oily, obviously. And then you can get that first hint of those baked fruits, along with that spice, the cinnamon that we talked about, maybe a little bread, and some little tickling at the sides from the smokiness. Oh, it's so good. So I'm going to leave that, let that open up while we chat, and I'm excited to have some time to chat with you about Scotch, and also to talk about the Macallan as it develops, the 12-year-old double cask. But Scotch is an interesting world, especially given the real profusion of spirits that exist out there. This is one of the things that I think makes it intimidating to people, is how many different types of Scotch you can find, and with the hundreds and thousands of different varieties that are on offer. Even like Macallan itself, Macallan has dozens of different, they call them expressions of the Macallan. But in terms of the basics, Scotch is a type of whiskey. And where it comes from and how it's aged is what really sets it apart from other types of whiskey, like bourbon, for instance. So bourbon is an American whiskey, or American-style whiskey. And the difference between bourbon and Scotch can be simple and also a little complex. First, of course, Scotch has to be made in Scotland. Second, Scotch uses barley as the primary grain. And thirdly, Scotch has to be aged for at least 3 years before it can be called Scotch. Bourbon is, it's a corn mash, or if it's rye bourbon, it's a rye mash. Irish whiskey is another kind of whiskey, and Irish whiskey uses different grains. It doesn't depend on the barley, and those basically are those are the main differences. So once you understand that Scotch is whiskey that comes from Scotland, that is aged at least 3 years, and that uses barley as the primary grain in the malt, then you kind of have a background to understand the different varieties of Scotch, and each of them have their own requirements. They each have their own sort of characteristics. And in order to sort of simplify our time together and to give us a framework for this discussion, I want to talk about the Scotch whiskey regulations, which were released in 2009. And these are legally defined divisions, and they outline 5 main categories that make up the Scotch world. But even within that, and we'll get to this towards the end of the show, even within the 5 main categories, there are still different unique regional styles of Scotch. And that, to me, is where the fun is, because you have so much to explore and so much to enjoy. It's a journey you can take, and you don't really ever have to stop because there's just so much out there. But here is some of the, I guess you would call it, regulations and the rules surrounding Scotch based on the Scotch whiskey regulations. First of all, when we talk about single malt Scotch, that is a designation that means only that it is the product of malt whiskey from a single distillery. The single and single malt Scotch does not refer to being aged in a single barrel. What it really means is that the malt whiskey comes from one distillery. And most single malt Scotches are blends of different whiskeys from that distillery, from a single distillery, that are, they use different proportions of the different whiskeys to create the flavor profile in a single malt Scotch. But that's what it means. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean that that it's only one barrel. It only means that all the Scotch in that bottle comes from one single distillery. Now, blended malt Scotch is the next term in the whiskey regulations. And this variety comes from more than one distillery. Now, it doesn't mean that the standards are any less stringent for blended malt Scotch. It just means that each of the whiskeys that constitute the blend come from a different distillery. They still have to be made from 100% barley. They still have to be produced in copper pot stills. But they come from different distilleries, which means that, blended malt Scotches have a real sort of flair for innovation, really, because a distillery or a whiskey maker, a master distiller, can play with a broad range or field of different whiskeys to create their main malted blend, or their main blended malt, excuse me. And, there are bottles of blended malt whiskey that have three whiskeys, or whiskey from three distilleries in it. And then there are some that go up to 5 and 10, and even one that has 16 different distilleries represented in the single bottle. And that's blended malt Scotch whiskeys. And now single malts have name recognition on their side. And so that's what most people think of when they are thinking of like high-end Scotches, single malt Scotch. But blended malt Scotches have some really fine offerings as well. And that's something that we'll probably end up exploring that train or that, how should I call it, that realm of the Scotch world, the Scotch universe, as we proceed through our little journey here. And single grain whiskey is the next category that is a part of the Scotch rules, the Scotch regulations, excuse me, the Scotch whiskey regulations released in 2009. So single grain whiskey is allowed to contain more than just malted barley, and the additional grain or grains can be either malted or unmalted. And what this means is usually that it's It comes in at a lower price point than single malt Scotch. But it's often, you kind of pay for the difference in terms of the lightness, which is not to say that they are bad. They're just generally lighter than other varieties of Scotch. And single grain whiskeys usually end up sort of blended with single malt whiskeys to create what they call blended Scotches. And we'll talk about blended Scotches in a little while. And the single grain whiskeys, people are nowadays, even though they usually are or have been created to be a part of the ingredient profile of a blended Scotch, there are some distillers who are now bottling and selling the single grain whiskeys as they are. I personally prefer single malts or blended Scotches to single grain whiskeys. I find them a little light and almost, in my view, a little astringent in some regards. Don't have as much complexity and body as I like, but they are out there. The next category of Scotch referenced in the Scotch whiskey regulations is the blended Scotches. Now, a blended Scotch is a blend of one or more single malt whiskeys with one or more single grain whiskeys. And distillers then mix the Scotches together to contain or to create different flavor profiles. And it is one of those sort of easy distinctions to see on a shelf, especially when you're looking at price, because the single malt category carries a lot of clout, so to speak. But blended Scotches are very much a part of the Scotch world. Your Dewar's, your Johnny Walker, your so on and so forth. These things are out there, and they are, frankly speaking, I think what most people who are not, let's say, Scotch aficionados are drinking when they are drinking Scotches. However, if you have something beautiful like this Macallan 12-year-old double cask, why would you reach for anything else? I mean, just, as it is sitting and breathing and opening up in this glass here, the sweet flavors that I talked about, the baked fruit and the vanilla, they are becoming more and more prominent. And the smokiness is receding just a bit. And I barely get any spice out of it right now. It's just so smooth. Oh, it's so smooth. This is good. Yeah, this is the stuff. But yeah, I mean, so yeah, as I was saying, single malts have all the prestige, but the fact is blended Scotches make up about 90% of the overall Scotch market. I mentioned two of the major brands, Johnny Walker and Dewar's, and they are out there. But as common as blended Scotches may be, not all blends are affordable. You got your super high-end, expensive blended Scotches, for example. Let's take the Johnny Walker Blue Label, which is upwards of $200 a bottle, which is more expensive than many single malt Scotches. So you can't always assume that a blended Scotch is less expensive than a single malt Scotch. You also can't always assume that a single malt Scotch is better than a blend, because the reality is, and this is kind of why we're having this chat today, the reality is that Scotch is not about right and wrong. Scotch is about what you enjoy, and it's about finding what you enjoy and then exploring in that category in a way that makes sense to you. Who wants to drink something they don't like? You know what I'm saying? And I know I have so many friends who tell me that they really want to get into Scotch. And I'm like, well, just find one you like and start there. There is one out there for you, you know? And the hard part for me is when people equate Scotch with excessive drinking. And I'm going to get up on the pulpit for a little while here and try to explain. Number one, anyone who seriously drinks Scotch is a serious Scotch drinker. They very rarely have more than 2 or 3 ounces in the glass, right? And if they're a serious Scotch drinker, that 2 or 3 ounces will last them for an hour, because the whole point of Scotch, the whole point of enjoying Scotch is to sip it and enjoy the flavors that are playing around on your tongue. It is meant to be savored. It is not meant to be gulped or guzzled. It is certainly not meant to be shotted, as the common vernacular term has become. You don't shot Scotch, right? I mean, and if you do, you're doing it wrong. And number two, if you shot Scotch, you're going to get drunk so quick you won't be able to enjoy your life, right? So the point here is this is a drink that is all about savoring the moment, whatever that moment may be. For me, I usually indulge in my Scotch with a book in my hand, in a quiet, private place. Yes, of course, I will also occasionally have a cigar, but that is how I sip my Scotch. It's a part of my Zen ritual, so to speak. And so I just wanted to say from this podium that we're not talking about being an alcoholic here. We're not talking about drinking to get drunk here. We're talking about sipping something that a distiller has taken decades to create and decades to learn the craft in order to be able to create something that you as the consumer can enjoy over a long period of time. So I guess in addition to learning about Scotch today, I want to say very clearly that Scotch is a sipping drink. And that's what you should do. Find a bottle you like, pour a couple of ounces, and literally a couple, into a good glass, something that concentrates the aroma above the glass so that you can get into the nose, and then sip and enjoy. I mean, why is that hard? Why is that? Anyway, so, okay, I'm going to put the pulpit away now. And the final official variety of Scotch from the Scotch regulations is something called blended grain Scotch whiskey. And this is the type of whiskey that's made from the blending of 2 or more single grain whiskeys from different distilleries. And unlike the blended malt varieties, none of the individual whiskeys in a blended grain Scotch whiskey make up, none of the whiskeys in it meet the requirements of single malt. And blended grain Scotch is known really as mild and mellow and light. It's not very common. You can't really find it very often. But there are some, if you look really hard, and you have to look really hard, I doubt you'll find any here in the Bahamas. But if you do, it's another way of rounding out your knowledge and experience with the scotches. And if it's something that you find and you're interested in it, go ahead and buy a bottle and try it out. It's, as I say, it's usually mild and light, a really mellow drink, and that's that's kind of one of the not one of that's kind of the standard expectation of a blended grain Scotch whiskey, and so that's the 5 types of Scotch that are officially recognized by the 2009 Scotch whiskey regulations. Once again, in order of, I guess, well, let's not say in any particular order. It's single malt Scotch whiskey. Then there's blended malt Scotch. And there's single grain Scotch. And blended Scotch, which is by far the most popular. And then blended grain Scotch, which is very rare in markets like ours, and a much lighter and more mellow offering in the Scotch world. And that's as I say, that's the 5 main types and categories of Scotch. And the next part of the conversation is looking at the main regions of Scotch. And there are 5 Scotch whiskey regions: Campbelltown, Highland, Islay, Lowland, and Speyside. And each of them offers a different perspective on Scotch whiskey. And what you find is each of the whiskey regions generally have a very similar sort of flavor profile, even though there are distinct differences between offerings even within the different distilleries themselves. Because remember now, with a single malt Scotch, all that means is that the malt is coming from the same distillery, and so the master distillers, they have great leeway to experiment even within a single malt beverage, and they do, and their experiments are definitely worth enjoying, in my humble opinion. Yeah, so let's start with Speyside. Speyside is the most densely populated whiskey region in the world. It's famous for fertile glens and, of course, the River Spey, hence Speyside. Speyside whiskeys are known for being easy on the peat and full of fruit. But of course, the question must immediately come to mind, Parker, what is peat? That's a very good question. So, here we go with, I guess we'll call this one another diversion on this journey through the world of Scotch. So, peat. What is peat? Peaty Scotch is very polarizing among whiskey drinkers. Some love it, some hate it, but very few are impartial, right? And for those who seek out peat, there's nothing better than an intensely smoky dram. One that, according to some research or articles that I've read, make your toes curl when the pungent odor hits your nose. I have a friend whose name I won't call, who's in love with the Lagavulin 16-year-old, which is one of the most intensely peated scotches I've ever tasted. And when they talk about your toes curling as the pungent odor hits your nose, that's the Lagavulin 16. And this dude, he calls it, what is it? Angel's milk or something like that. It's amazing. Yeah, it's really weird. But it's no question that peat is a strange component. So a little history as to what it is and how it gets into your scotch and then into your glass. The peat is basically decomposed organic plant matter that's been compressed into the ground for thousands of years. It's essentially, some people call it young coal, right? But peat covers about 23% of Scotland, mostly in the Highlands and the Islands. But it's found throughout Ireland, northern England, Scandinavia, parts of Russia, and the U.S. and Canada, too. People originally used peat as an energy source because it burns similarly to coal, smoky and odorous, but consistent. And some sort of, I guess, intelligence from the whiskey world. Simon Brooking, who's a master ambassador of Lafroig Scotch whiskey, he says it's difficult to pinpoint when peat was first used to make whiskey. He said that while there's no exact known date, commercial distilling began in Scotland in the 18th century. Originally, peat was introduced to whiskey by Scots who used it to heat the pot stills. However, the peaty flavor in Scotch actually comes from the malting process, where the dried barley absorbs the smoke odor from the burning peat used in the drying. One of the things that I found really interesting is how peat sort of has how its harvesting has changed. It used to be cut from the ground by hand. So they used to use a shovel to expose the peat into shelf-like formations, and then a long hand slicer would be used to cut through it to form rectangles that looked like slices of fudge cake. And then the peat would be dried out in stacks for several weeks. And that's what used to happen. Now it's mostly done with machines. Douglas Duggar Bowman, Ardbegg's head warehouse man. Ardbeg is a very it's a distillery very heavily associated with peat. And he talks about the fact that a lot of distilleries on Scotland source their peat from one massive peat bank that's then transported back to the malting center. So here's how it gets into your scotch. The peat is put into a massive kiln and burned underneath the malted barley, which stops the germination process and sends wafts of smoke up into the grain. And this is the key step in the process that defines the typically smoky character of peated Islay malts like Ardbeg, Lafroig, Lagavulin, like I mentioned, and Brechladich's Octomore expression. And we're going to be tasting the Octomore here in a couple of weeks on the show. So I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, that's peat. And that is what is mostly absent in Speyside whiskeys. So now we're going back to Speyside, right? So they have really full of fruit flavors like apple, pear, honey, vanilla, spice. All of these things have a role in expressions of Scotch from this region, which is commonly matured in sherry casks. So some of the popular Speyside whiskeys that I've seen here in the Bahamas, the Balvenie, the Glenfarclas, Glenlivet, Singleton, the Glenfiddich, and of course the one that I'm drinking today is a Macallan. Speaking of which, another sip of the Macallan 12. Oh man. Oh yeah. So it's opened up completely now. And it's like drinking a really it's like drinking an oatmeal cookie almost. There's oatmeal with the raisins and a little bit of the nuttiness and some of the honey and it's amazing. So yeah, those ones are Speyside whiskeys, and I believe you know those of you who've had them, you can attest to the fact that they're full of fruit and really light on the peat. The next region is the lowland region. And lowland region is soft and smooth malts are characteristic of lowland Scotch. They are gentle. People use words like elegant, and the palate is supposedly reminiscent of grass. Things like honeysuckle and ginger and toffee and toast. These whiskeys are often lighter in character and considered to be perfect for like pre-dinner drinks. I've seen the Glenkinnicky here, and I've seen some liquor stores have the Ashentishan, which is actually a lowland Scotch that I like a lot. Then, of course, there's the Highland Scotch region, which takes it also takes in the islands and has a huge diversity of flavors and characters. You got your lighter whiskeys all the way to your salty, like coastal malts. The Highlands kind of have a bit of everything, right? Some really popular and excellent Highland whiskeys. You got Dalmore, the Glenmorangie, Aberfeldy, Oban, and I've even seen the Clynelish here. So those are all Highland Scotches. The Dalmore was among my favorites. It's still among my favorites. And so is the Oban. Those are both exceptional Scotches. The Glenmorangie too is nice. Campbellton whiskies Campbellton is the next region, and they are also, it's a kind of a varied region with a bunch of different flavor profiles. You got hints of salt, smoke, fruit, vanilla, and toffee. So these are robust whiskeys with a rich character. Springbank, Campbellton, Glen Scotia are some of the distilleries in Campbellton. I haven't seen very many Campbellton whiskeys here in the Bahamas. Then you have Islay, which most people who are not Scotch or of Scotch extraction, they say Islay, but it is the word is actually pronounced Islay, and it is it's an island where the majority of the population is involved in whiskey production. And this is, when we were talking about peat earlier, Islay is where the peat reigns supreme. It's famous for fiery, heavily peated whiskeys like the Lagavulin, like the Ardbeg that I mentioned, like Lafroig and Balmore and Brichladdich. So the Brichladdich makes the Octomore that I mentioned earlier. And it's an experience. So, heavy smoke. Seriously, it's a really big, hard flavor. So I kind of think that you should work your way up to it. But if you're the kind of person that likes a lot of smoke, like if you really like a lot of smoke in your barbecue or that kind of thing, it's something to think about. The Scotches from Islay, which looks like it says Islay. And so those are the 5 regions, the Scotch-producing regions of Scotland: Campbellton, Highland, Islay, Lowland, and Speyside. And they each offer a different perspective on Scotch. And I think that it is entirely within the bounds of reason. And I think it's probably even a really good idea for anyone who wants to go on the Scotch journey to try to make it a goal to try at least one bottle of Scotch from each of the 5 regions. And as you're going through your journey, try to see if you agree with the overall expectations that come from understanding a little bit about what these scotches generally are thought to taste like. I recommend starting with the Speyside scotches because, like I say, they're very light on the peat, and they are typically full of fruit flavors. The Balvenie is a great place to start, but the Macallan is the cream of the crop. The Glenlivet is also very popular for good reason. Glenfiddich is very popular for good reason. And after you've started with Speyside, I would try the Highland region, where you get some lighter whiskeys, and even some, odd flavors. And I say odd as in not quite as fruity, but, interesting and complex flavors. I would try maybe the Dalmore and the Glenmorangie. The Oban, to me, for the longest time, the Oban 14 was like the perfect bottle of Scotch. The Highland Park Magnus sort of knocked the Oban 14 off the pedestal for me, but it's still a very tight race if we're gonna put it in those terms. So I'd start with Speyside, then I'd go with a bottle from a Highlands, and then I'd go with a bottle from the Lowlands. Try the Ashentishan. I've seen that here in town. And then after that, if you have a friend who's traveling, see if you could get them to bring you a Campbellton whiskey. Something, these are rich and robust scotches that have really fruit-forward flavors with, and the fruit is balanced with a hint of salt and smoke. And I think it's, they're good scotches that are very complicated, and I like that. And then once you've gone through all the other four regions, try the Islay scotches. In terms of peatiness, Bruichladdich has an offering called the Classic Laddie, which does not have peat. It's not a peated Scotch. But then the Port Charlotte that they have is lightly peated, and then the Octomore is heavily peated. Any of the Ardbeg Scotches are going to be heavily peated to some degree. The Laphroaig, like the Laphroaig 10, you can find in a couple of different liquor stores around town. That is a light, sort of a medium peat, which adds a real depth to the Scotch. And then for adventurous Scotch neophytes, try the Lagavulin. Brace yourself when you do, but give it a shot and see. It might just speak to you. It might be something that you find that you like more than anything else. And I feel like that's kind of the vibe with these scotches, is that there's no right or wrong. There's just what you like. And the only way to know what you like is to try them. And sometimes I feel like we put too much of a focus on the idea that Scotch is somehow reserved for rich people, or that somehow it is a luxury. I mean, something like the Macallan is definite. The Macallan is luxury incarnate. I am not trying to get away from that. Okay, but for every multi-$1,000 bottle of Macallan Scotch that you'll find in a Jimmy's Wines and Spirits, you could find a $50 to $60 bottle of Scotch also in a Jimmy's Wines and Spirits or anywhere else that that you might enjoy as much. You might find a $20 or $30 bottle of Scotch that speaks to you in a way, right? So the price point is not really what it's all about. What it's all about is what's inside the bottle, and that's what you judge a Scotch on. If you drink it and you like it, that's all that matters. And I feel like sometimes we make a big deal out of this in a way that is thoroughly unnecessary, and I hope that that sort of explaining some of the history and the typology and some of the regions and what to expect from them has helped to demystify Scotch to an extent. I feel like that's part of the service journalism that we're trying to do here at the Sunday Scotch Society, is to demonstrate that this is not out of your reach if it is something that you're interested in. And I think I've made that case today in a way that I feel is convincing. I know that I'll hear from you on whether or not it was my case was as convincing as I believe it was. But there it is. So again, just to recap before we move on to one short thing I wanted to talk about before we leave today. The 2009 Scotch whiskey regulations outline 5 main categories of Scotch, and these are legally defined divisions that I believe understanding them will help you understand the nuances between the hundreds and thousands of different bottles of Scotch that you see on the shelf in your neighborhood liquor store. So, single malt Scotch means Scotch where the malt that is used to make the Scotch is from one distillery. It has nothing to do with single barrel. It just means all the malt that goes into the Scotch that is in your bottle comes from a single distillery. That's what single malt means. Blended malt Scotch is that the malt that goes into the whiskey that goes into your bottle comes from more than one distillery. And that's a blended malt Scotch. A single grain Scotch is allowed to contain more than just malted barley, and the additional grain or grains can be either malted or unmalted. They're generally a lower price point than the single malt Scotch, and they are great in use. They're great when you use them in cocktails. They're often lighter, and they are used traditionally with single malt Scotches to create blended Scotches. And a blended Scotch is technically a blend of one or more single malt whiskeys with one or more single grain whiskeys. And that is not to say that blended Scotches are somehow inferior to single malt Scotches. Blended Scotches own 90% of the market, and some of them can be as expensive or more expensive than their single malt cousins. Take the Johnny Walker Blue as a $200 bottle and more. And then after the blended Scotch, you got blended grain Scotch, which is made from the blending of two or more single grain whiskeys from different distilleries. These are very mild and mellow and light scotches, and they're not very common. So I doubt you'll find them here in the Bahamas, but they do exist out there. And in service of being a completionist, if you see it, if you see a bottle and you're interested, there's absolutely no reason to not buy that bottle and see what it tastes like. And if you do, in the name of all that is decent and holy, please tell me, because I would love to know. I haven't had a blended grain Scotch that I'm aware of, so I'd be very interested to know. And again, the five regions, the five whiskey regions are Campbellton, which is known for robust, rich scotches full of flavor. There's Speyside, which is known for fruity scotches that have very light or no peat at all. Then there's Lowland scotches, which are lighter in character, and Highland scotches, which are, since it takes in the Highlands and also the islands of Scotland, there's a really huge diversity of flavors and characters from Highland scotches. And then there's the Islay scotches, or what looks like Islay, and that region is famous for fiery, heavily peated whiskeys. And knowing all of that, I think that you are equipped now for your own journey into the world of Scotch. And you got to keep us here at the Sunday Scotch Society apprised of what it is you and your Scotch journey are up to. You got to let us know what you're drinking and how it tastes and what your thoughts were. And you should keep a journal. You may not actually have to keep a written journal, but you should keep notes on your phone at the very least. Just so you know what you like and you know who makes it, so you know how to find it when it's time for you to find it again. And I think that's, I don't think that is going crazy. I might be wrong. I might already be crazy, and so all of the stuff that I don't think of as crazy might just be crazy anyway because I'm already crazy. But hey, if I'm crazy, I'm happy. It's okay. Anyway, so yeah. So I was checking something out in one of my, occasional deep dives in in the internet. God help us all. And it was fascinating to me to learn that you've seen Japanese whiskeys on the shelves in the liquor stores, and of course you know that Canada makes whiskey, and so does Ireland and the U.S. Right? Irish whiskey is called Irish whiskey. U.S. their whiskeys are generally bourbon and rye. Canadian whiskey is what it is. Japanese whiskeys are they call it whiskey as well. But I found it interesting to realize that they're now Italian whiskey makers, and I really want to try something from. There's a new distillery near Milan called Stradiferata. I'm very interested in seeing if I could find something from them, but that's really fascinating to me. There's a French distillery in Paris. There's one in Copenhagen. There's something called In the Welsh Wind, which is a new Welsh distillery that is making its first whiskey this year, with malted Welsh barley and using some green barley into the mash. It's fascinating. There's another one in the Netherlands called the Chambric. So there's whiskey all over the world. There's one it's called Keval Licors. It's the first whiskey maker in Catalonia, in Spain, near the French border, and it's to me, I just think it's really cool that that all of these different countries are experimenting with the whiskey tradition, and I'm looking forward to seeing how any of those whiskeys either make their way here to the Bahamas, or if I can experience them when I'm out in the world. But I'm looking forward to that. I think it's a really interesting trend to watch. And we don't really have barley here in the Bahamas, so but we are creative. I'll just put that there and leave it. There's another thing where this year the experts were expecting Asia to be like the focus of sort of the momentum generated by Japanese whiskeys that have led to experimental approaches in whiskey in places like South Korea and Singapore, and new distilleries in China. So I'm feeling like it's going to be a thing. There's another sort of trend that I think people are really going to be paying attention to in whiskey, and that is sort of net zero, which is weird, right? But heat and energy and the carbon footprint of the whiskey industry is something that people are focusing on now. And I just wanted to say that that's happening, and that it's interesting to me that is the direction that the whiskey industry has taken. So yeah, it's a thing. Anyway, thank you for joining me today for this wonderful solo ride on the Sunday Scotch Society. I hope you enjoyed our time together. Oh, I know I certainly enjoyed it. Anytime I have the excuse of drinking the Macallan Scotch, I am excited to take that opportunity. And we will see you, I guess, on the next go-round. Alrighty. What is it I say now? Das Darovia. There you go. Das Darovia.
Yeah.